The changing balance of power. And before I begin, there is a phrase, or a Sanskrit verse from the Upanishads that says, Asto ma sadgamaya, tamso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritam gamaya. Talk about power. It would be an interesting idea to know what is power. So what does everyone here associate with power? Any answers? No? All right, so I'll just launch off. Usually I do things Socratically, but power comes from vulgar Latin, potere. Potere itself comes from pure Latin, which is posse, which literally means to be able to. So if we go back to the etymological roots of power, it's very simply an ability or capability of doing something. So let's say if you are a king and you own sovereignty over a certain realm, your ability to rule is the source of your power. If you're a priest, your ability to get others to believe in your system of faith is the source of your power. If you are a merchant, even then you are essentially dealing with power, because whatever contract you enter into, the other side, the other party has to believe you have the power to enact it. Now, the idea that power must be constrained is an old idea. But very simply, there is an old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Therefore, in society, we try to have a balance of power. That's why you have the division between the executive, legislature, and judiciary in most democracies. That is why in the Indian context, or in the context of the US, any federal system strives to have a balance of power between the center and the states. And state rights, even today, continue to be a contentious issue both in the United States and here, and any federal system. Now, the balance of power internationally means, very simply, that no one country or one nation state dominates others. There's a long history of thinkers who've talked about it, and we could talk about Thucydides or others, starting from classical Greek times to Machiavelli and David Hume, and of course more recent people like Metternich, who was there in the last, or 2 centuries, nearly 2 centuries ago, and of course people in diplomacy in various nation states today. So I'm going to focus on balance of power more in terms of different societies than necessarily nation states or internally. And because different societies organize themselves in the form of nation states, we will be viewing a lot of nation states. But remember, nation states are nothing more than a constituent of citizens. And so ultimately every nation state is as dynamic as its citizens. And so we'll be looking a lot at social, economic, and political issues. So there are 3 aspects of the current balance of power that we are going to examine. First, economics. Second, politics. And third, culture. But before we start examining this, let us take a step back and look things in context. Historically, how did this current balance of power come into being? If we look at the current balance of power, it lies primarily with the United States. Now, if we go back to 1991 or even 1989, that's when the Berlin Wall fell, and 1991 is when the Soviet Union fell. And before this, we have balance of power between the Soviets and the Americans. We go back to 1945, and it's Europe which is the beating heart of the world. The League of Nations is set up in Geneva, not in New York. We go back pre-Second World War, and Germany is rising, but Britain has the biggest empire. The French have the number 2 empire. You go back to the First World War, similar story. The Austro-Hungarians are presiding over a tottering empire. The Ottomans are presiding over a rotting empire. The Tsars are presiding over an empire that is seeing a struggle for its soul. And the French, who are democratic, in fact even Republican by now, are presiding over a minor, actually a major empire, but comparatively minor empire. And the British are presiding over Pax Britannica. And the US is expanding, of course, to the West Coast, but the US is, or has expanded by the time the First World War breaks out, but the US is not particularly important globally. So the further back in the past we go, and we go back right up to the start of modern times, and we find that there are 3 empires that are dominating: Ottoman, Mughal, and Ming. And so throughout history, the balance of power has shifted between different regions, different empires, different societies. At some point, a certain society will be dynamic. Its civilizational ideas will catch the fancy of a large part of the world. Those of us who are from India know that the biggest Hindu temple is in Angkor Wat. That's in Cambodia. That's not here, within the confines of the geographical boundaries of India. The biggest Buddhist structure is Borobudur. That's in modern-day Indonesia. And the tallest statues of the Buddha, or Gautam Buddha, as we say, were not within the borders of India or even Pakistan. They were in Afghanistan. They were blown away by the Taliban. So the interesting thing about the balance of power is it constantly shifts. If we look across time and space, it is a most fascinating phenomenon. And today, the balance of power largely is in the favor of the US. There are minor powers, such as the European powers. There are the rising powers that are in the East. But even today, the balance of power, fundamentally, if you consider it a seesaw, is largely with the United States of America. So let's, without further ado, get into analyzing the first source of its power, economic. Even today, the US is the largest economy. It is 25% of the world GDP. The dollar is the reserve currency of the entire planet. The international institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are in Washington, D.C. And finance, the beating heart of finance, still continues to be Wall Street. The United States has companies like McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, and Pepsi. Even today, I read in the newspaper that the Indian Institutes of Technology were a little perturbed that McKinsey was skipping campus recruitment. They were going to recruit directly through their alumni network and social media and all that jazz. And it's fascinating that even today, so many years after independence, the high point of achievement in Indian society is working not anymore for a British company, but for an American one. And so economically, the US is dominant globally. It's not just the case in India, it's the case in the entire European Union, it's the case even in China. When it comes to technology, we are in a city that is trying to define itself by technology and is certainly one of the key places increasingly on the planet. Yesterday I met a Brazilian, and he had flown in all the way from Brazil to the Google campus here. He works for Google. So Hyderabad is right there on the map with Google and Microsoft, and a lot of companies operate here. But in technology, the bar is set by the United States. It's Microsoft, it is Google, it is Facebook. The United States has a great advantage of cheap gas. They are coming up with 3D printing. They are coming up with new biotech. They have new manufacturing now, which is increasingly called smart manufacturing. And the US is back in manufacturing and in exports after the recession. All the Asians, including those in Taiwan, China, Japan, are talking about it. So the US has an inherent strength and a dynamism, and it certainly is top dog in the world economy. Just think of it. The population of the US, 315 million or so. How much of it, what percentage of the world population is that? That's, let's say roughly 5%. 5% of the world population having 25% of the GDP. Pretty powerful figure. Now, that's so much about economics. Now let us take a look at the second prism, politics. When it comes to politics, I like to be a little old-fashioned. I say politics, is about power. It comes from polis, the Greek word for city. It's the affairs of a city, it's the affairs of a country, it's the affairs of the world. And politics, to use another old saying, flows from the barrel of the gun. At the end of the day, power in America is exercised by the current white population because they committed genocide. They killed all the natives and took all the land. So the idea of terra nulla was just a convenient idea to justify what they were doing. Terra nulla means nothing but null land. It basically means that if savages inhabit the land and they're not making productive use of it, then their property rights are null and void, and therefore, as a settler from England, as a Puritan or a Methodist or a German Lutheran, you come into Wisconsin, some savage Native Americans called Red Indians own this land, but you're perfectly justified in taking it over, because if you don't take it over, that land is going waste. And so, really, the history of America is a history soaked in blood. It's God, guns, and gold. Actually, the gold applied more south of Rio Grande. It was the Portuguese and Spaniards who robbed a lot of gold from the Latin American civilizations. And the British, lest we forget, we are in a country that was colonized until not too long ago. It's only in 1947 that India got its freedom, but even today, the Indian Penal Code is still the penal code drafted by Lord Macaulay. We haven't changed the 1860 Penal Code, drafted 3 years after the mutiny, or what the British called the mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny, and barely 2 years after Queen Victoria took over. And the Indian Police Act of 1861 vintage is a similarly ridiculously outdated act, but it still persists. And the same is true for most former British colonies. They may have won their political freedom, but culturally they are still slaves in more ways than one. Now, politics, as I said, flows out of the barrel of the gun, and that's where the US is streets ahead of everyone else. The military budget of the US is $610 billion a year, as per the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. There's a very pretty graph. You can go on the internet and check that out. It turns out that the military budget of the next 7 powers is only $601 billion combined. This is China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, the United Kingdom, India, and Germany. The next 7 powers put together spend less than the Americans. So guess what? If you don't listen to America, what can America do? It can send in an aircraft carrier. What else can it do? It can kill inconvenient people without trial through use of drones, which it does frequently, whether it is in Somalia or Afghanistan. It can make sure that the laws of the seas, which have largely been drafted by it, are enforced. And that brings me on to a very important point, is that the US has drafted the rules of the current international order, just as the British did. a generation ago. Whether it is the International Monetary Fund, whether it is the World Bank, whether it is even the United Nations, which is headquartered in New York, not the most convenient place on the planet, by the way. It's not the center of the world. The United States is de facto an island, and it's an insular island. In the US, world news is 30 seconds, and it's a dog on a skateboard in Sydney. And none of the news that happens elsewhere is really important unless bombings happen in nostalgic European capitals like Paris. Bombings elsewhere, who cares? So the US is not naturally the geographical center of the world, but because they are politically powerful, because they've written the rules of the game, the United Nations is in New York instead of, say, Geneva. Which means that if you're the CIA, you can spy on everyone more conveniently. So the rules of the game have been written by the Americans, and the institutions have been created by the Americans, and this is nothing new. All of Europe is still functioning as per Roman law. And the Romans were the ones who built the highways and the aqueducts and all that jazz. So the Americans are just the Romans of today. That brings me on to the third prism, culture. No dominant power that tries to rule by force alone survives for too long. It's too expensive. The Nazis tried it, didn't work. The reason was they thought they were Übermenschen and everyone else was Untermenschen. So the Untermenschen weren't equal, and therefore the core was never dynamic enough to make space for the periphery. They had to kill everyone. Concentration camps, gas chambers. Now, they being Germans, they thought, well, we shouldn't be stabbing people. That's not efficient. We will use gas chambers. It'll be superb and efficient, and the trains will run on time. And they did so. The British were a little more sophisticated. They just starved everyone to death here, and then they said, oh, it was an accident. What can we do? The crops failed. Not the most efficient, but a much more effective and sustainable way, because you couldn't blame them for killing Indians. And they managed to convince Indians that they were ruling India for India's own benefit. And as they managed to convince the Kenyans and the South Africans and the others, and they created a comprador elite, an elite of brown sahibs, an elite which Macaulay, Lord Macaulay, none other, said were Indian only in color, but Europeans in taste. What you could derisively call, or derisively call, coconuts, brown outside and white inside, who would help the British rule the savages here. And so the British way of ruling was very smart. They used co-option, not just coercion. Co-opt local elites, convince them about the fact that adopting English mannerisms, adopting English culture is the same as modernization. Enslave people in their minds and give them something, share a little bit of the pie, throw some bones to the dogs, and that helps. Now, that is putting it a touch too brutally. The pie that is shared depends on the empire, depends on the dominant power, and sometimes what happens is that the core will share more with the periphery, and the core has to have less of an ethnic identity, less of its own identity as it expands. Let's take a classic example of the Ottomans. The Ottomans could not have ruled over such a diverse land if there wasn't seat at the table for all the local elites. The local elites needed to have seats at the table, and they did. Same is true for the Mughals. The Mughals came in and they had taken over from Sher Shah Suri, the second time around, right? The Pathans. Now, the Pathans and the Mughals never saw eye to eye. There were lots of rebellions. And of course, Akbar felt threatened, Akbar the Great. None other felt threatened by his own relatives. So to create a more sustainable empire, he co-opted the Rajputs. And so one of the best ways of expanding in those days was conquest, and an even better way was marriage. And lest we forget, Bombay, or what we now call Mumbai, was won by the British through marriage. It was dowry. And of course, Charles didn't want to marry Catherine of Braganza, and she was apparently fat and ugly, and he protested to his minister, and the minister said, well, we need Bombay. And he said, well, but she's fat and ugly. And he said, well, who's told you not to have a mistress? Or many? And that was the realpolitik through which things functioned. And so there was a seat at the table for Rajput generals like Manthan, who were given prosperous subas so they could build their fancy palaces in the deserts of Rajasthan. And they became the sword arm of the empire. And guess what? In the core, they had no power. In a Muslim empire, a Sunni Muslim empire, they had no power, no base. Some cousin of Akbar could have always revolted and rallied some people and claimed legitimacy. But Man Singh, no, he was a kafir. So Man Singh's position was entirely due to the patronage of Akbar. Same is true for all the Shias, the Iranian Shias who were brought in. And so a lot of minorities, as the empire expands, are co-opted, not just because they help rule the empire externally, but they also give strength to the ruling power internally. Because their entire position and status is due to whoever is in power. Whether it is Todar Mal, who reformed the finances of India. They'd have no power base in the capital. So they're wonderful. And enlightened empires and enlightened superpowers manage to live because they understand the nuance of power. And America understands it, or understood it, at least in the post-Second World War era, better than anyone else. That's why they created institutions. That's why they said we'll have a rule-bound international order. That's why they focus so much on exporting their culture. And you could say that the modern American empire is propped up more by Hollywood and Harvard. It's propped up more by McDonald's and Coca-Cola. It's propped up more by Apple and Tesla than by anything else. Now, all of us here, sitting here in this fine land, know that the dream of a number of parents is to see their child in MIT or Harvard. Correct? That's the highest aspiration, not just here, but in Latin America, in Beijing. Less so in Europe, but even there, the fixation with American educational institutions is enormous. The fixation with Hollywood has destroyed native cinema in many countries. Here, of course, we are slightly different. Our Telugu films and Hindi films copy American plots, but indigenize them. So, if you look at the entrepreneurial ambitions of a lot of Indians, they want to be like Steve Jobs. They want to be like Elon Musk. So the great American dream is the most powerful export of all, and there is a chap called Joseph Nye, Joe Nye, whom I happen to know, who was in the US government. He was, I believe, the Assistant Secretary of State. He's also someone who has been the big boss of the Kennedy School at Harvard. So Joe came up with this idea of soft power. I mean, it's nothing but this idea that you use culture to dominate, which is an older idea, much more sophisticated idea that Antonio Gramsci came up with, this Italian intellectual. And he applied it more in terms of class struggle and domination by culture of a ruling class, which rules more through getting everyone to believe in its culture than through sending the Cossacks wielding their sabers. And so the US is top dog to a great degree because other people believe in it. Its universities are full of immigrants from around the world. It has been a melting pot of sorts. People have familial relations there. People believe in the dynamism of the American economy, in the solvency of the dollar or the American bonds, solvency of the American governments. Pardon me, that is the correct term. And the sanctity of its institutions. Now, that being said, as the French said, la plus ça change, the more things change, the more they remain the same, and yet they change, to twist it a little bit. The balance of power that has been in America's favor for so long is changing, and it is changing dramatically. And it's not changing because there's a new rival. Everyone makes a song and dance about China, but how many people here want their children to go to Beda? Who's even heard of Beda? Raise your hands. How many? Hardly anyone. Beda is Beijing University. So China's economy is growing, but China does not offer anything like an inclusive dream for the rest of the world. Neither does India, really. India just copies ideas from abroad, still venerates the white man. Africa still continues with its colonial system and colonial borders. The Middle East is going through its own version of the 30 Years' War. Europe is old, exhausted, and nearly bankrupt, or at least parts of it are. Germany is an exception. Northern Europe is an exception. But the interesting thing is, despite the lack of a challenger, American domination is wavering. It is on thin ice. And why is that? So let us go through all the three things I have talked about and revisit them. Economics. Yes, America is 25% of the world GDP, but in 1945 it was 50% of the world GDP. So America is in relative decline. Its economy is still growing, but it is not as dominant as it once was. More importantly, America after the Second World War was giving loans, was giving credit to everyone else. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. Japan was rebuilt through American largesse. Today America is a debtor nation. It has mountains of debt. It has an $18 trillion debt. And its GDP is 17.5 trillion. That means its debt GDP ratio is over 100%. That's crazy because look, the debt GDP ratio of Spain is only 93.9%. The debt GDP ratio of France is 97.5%. Of Italy and Portugal is 130%. And of Greece is 180%. Now, you may make the argument, and some will, that look, America is a younger society, it's not aging as fast, it has more innovation, so it'll be able to pay back its debt, and America's debt is denominated in dollars. And they can always print back dollars and give you nothing but paper. What's the big deal? You save all your money and you buy American bonds, and one fine day American can say, you know what, you want your money back? We'll just print the dollars, here's your money, take it. It may be worthless, but they can do that. Because, remember, when kings ruled the land and they had to repay debts, they could always mint more money. They just, the quantity of the gold in their coins went down. They debased their currency. That led to inflation, but that was a problem of the masses, not the kings. Eventually, of course, such kings fell. And that's exactly what America has been doing. The global economy has a debt problem, massive debt problem. Every country is in debt. In the case of America, the problem is accentuated by internal debt. Not just the country is in debt, but students are in debt. People take mortgages to buy houses. Families are in debt. Poorer sections of society are in credit card debt. In India, most individuals, most families are not in debt. Neither is that true in most of Asia. Asians save. They are more frugal. Yes, there is consumerism, but that's a relatively new phenomenon. Most Indian households, particularly those with a sense of connection with the past, tend to be frugal. The Germans tend to be frugal. A lot of the Europeans, the Dutch and others tend to be frugal. Actually, they tend to be not just frugal, they tend to be miserly. No one in Europe is going to take you out for dinner the way they take you out for dinner in Asia. So you don't have the individual debt and the family debt that you see in the US and other places. Countries may be in debt. That's a separate issue. The US debt problem is actually therefore much bigger than it seems. So you have this huge debt problem in the world. Lots of people are in debt, and that's going to shake up a lot of the world, but America too, maybe last, because America is still seen as more stable. So as the world goes through economic crisis, there's a flight to the US economy to buy real estate, to buy shares of Facebook, to buy farms perhaps in Montana, you name it. The rich, particularly from the emerging economies and places going through war and turmoil, flee with their money to America. That's why the Chinese are gobbling up houses. The Russians are all over New York. And whilst that flight will prop up the dollar, there's only that much that can happen. After all, not every Russian can go to America. Certainly not if Donald Trump wins power. He's going to tag all the Muslims, just as the Nazis tagged the Jews. So there's a limit to capital flight, particularly when the dollar is devaluing through quantitative easing. In fact, everyone else is devaluing too. So you have this printing of money. That means asset prices are going up and up and up, and bubbles are forming, and that's thanks to the Fed. Really what America is doing is it's triggered competitive devaluation as a new form of de facto trade war. Instead of tariffs, smooth Hawley that happened in the 1930s, now it is competitive devaluation. Well, that's one problem, and no one has a solution in America to it or elsewhere to it. Everyone's looking to America. And that leads us on to another economic problem, the mismatch between supply and demand. Now we know very well, particularly because we live in a poor country where over 50% of the people, of the children under 5 are stunted because of lack of access to clean drinking water and proper nutrition. We know if we live here that there is a huge demand for clean water. There is a huge demand for basic food. And there is this demand not just here, but in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of Asia. But the world economy is structured around a supply of stuff. The world economy is supplying something like this, a smartphone, supplying more pencils, supplying cars, supplying goods that perhaps you don't need. And so this whole mismatch in the world economy between supply and demand is very reminiscent of the 1920s, because you had massive supply, but demand of what was needed didn't exist, and the demand for what was being produced, demand for what was needed wasn't met, and demand for what was being produced didn't exist. So there's a limit to stuff the Americans can buy. How much stuff are they going to buy? How much stuff is China going to produce? And so the whole consumption-led economy is in question, particularly because of the damage it does to the environment, the social dislocation, and lest we forget, the incredible inequality that is emerging from all of this. The short-termism of Wall Street, the rapaciousness of unfettered greed. Greed is good, as that classic film, Gordon, what was the film's name? Wall Street, perhaps, Gordon Gekko. The Reagan extremism, which is very Judeo-Christian in my view, wherein there's no sense of balance, has its limits. And in a way, one could argue, as my teaching assistant at Berkeley, who is the finest young professor, finest young historian that I have met, and I have met tons of academics around the world, but T. Young is a brilliant young Vietnamese American, and he said that the end of history, which Francis Fukuyama talks about, was supposed to lead to a widening of the arc of opportunity. It wasn't just meant to give people more McDonald's and more Coca-Cola, which incidentally is heart attack and diabetes, buy one get one free with some cancer thrown in. But he posited that, look, the end of history was meant to provide people with more meaningful employment. The soullessness of the Soviet system with a top-down structure which controlled every single aspect of your lives, which was command and control, was discredited. And here the market would lead to a more entrepreneurial, a more fulfilling way of life, and a more coherent society, one where you'd have peace and harmony and meaning. A lot of the dislocation and anger you see is because this model has failed the people. And in a way, what Marx predicted was that there's an internal contradiction in capitalism, because to increase profits, you need to drive down wages. But if you drive down wages, who's going to buy all this stuff? And the internal contradiction of capitalism is sort of, or the American style, Wall Street style capitalism is coming to play, particularly with more and more people owning most of the wealth in the land. And a classic example of it is the current US presidential election. Everyone knows that it costs an obscene amount. Everyone knows that it is fundamentally about advertising. Yesterday, when I was talking to people, my wonderful hosts, and of course my Brazilian friend whom I met, regardless of what nationality, everyone who looks at the American political debate says, what is going on? This is banal, this is trite, this is meaningless, and that is a fundamental question that Americans are failing to address. So the economic system that they have posited is in crisis. They have a privileged, largely white upper class, and a white working class that is increasingly unemployed. You have rust belt all over America as you start driving away from the coasts. I've driven across America 4 times. It's fascinating to see crumbling towns with no jobs. And this working class can perhaps work at Tyson's or work as baristas. There are no jobs left like there used to be in Detroit. You have a Hispanic underclass that is acting as car mechanics and lawnmowers and toilet cleaners. That's also living life on the edge of the margins. And you have a black criminalized underclass, which has no hope in hell, because 1/3 of the black men in America end up in jail. And America is more willing to spend on militarizing its police than on midnight basketball programs for its black population. It doesn't make economic sense. It is like shooting yourself in both your temples with big magnums. And actually, if you think that's a metaphor, just imagine gun rights in America. If you go to gun fairs in America, anyone can just walk in and buy a gun. You see children with guns. I've been to some gun shows. It's hilarious. 13-year-olds posing with guns, with no idea of how to handle the gun, but that's a separate matter. So economically, the American system is increasingly hollow, and that brings me on to the politics of America. And as I referred to, there are fundamental problems, economic problems in the US. But the politics of America has become so dysfunctional, so divided, and so deeply toxic that common sense actions are never brought to the table. You have a military that is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder because it's sent off to areas where it has no clue why it is there. People come back demoralized, and you have drone strikes done arbitrarily, which creates more enemies, more resentments, more terrorist strikes, and this vicious cycle is going on, and no one takes a step back and says, hang on a moment, why are you doing so many drone strikes? Do we even know who are these people we are killing? For instance, take an example of Baghdad. When the Japanese came to Singapore during the Second World War, did they fire the gardener who was looking after the royal gardens? No, they didn't. But when the Americans took over Baghdad, they fired everyone because everyone was supposedly a member of the Ba'ath Party. Well, they had to be, otherwise Saddam would have killed them. And now the Americans come and blame the victims. And they say, you were a member of the Ba'ath Party, you're fired. So the Baghdad Museum's curator went, the police went, and guess what? The entire museum, the entire civilizational richness of that country was looted. In fact, in my view, in many ways, they were worse than the Japanese during the Second World War. And then they condoned torture. It was a civilizational fall because the Americans convicted the Japanese for the war crime of waterboarding, and they started doing it themselves. So politically, somewhere America has started losing the plot. The internal tension in America is also because it's an issue about tax. Well, if you have a lot of people who are unemployed and you have an economy that's built around technology, and let's say you have artificial intelligence, how many people do you actually need to produce anything? Not that many. So your economic productive capacity, the productive capacity of your economy may be growing, but your economic base is shrinking. You don't have that many jobs, but you still have 315 million people. You can't kill them all as you did in the past. So these people want bread, and so they say, well, we need welfare, therefore increase taxes. And the Republicans, you know, who have the interests of their support base, they say no taxes. The Democrats, who get all the black and Hispanic vote, they say more taxes. And the fight becomes more and more toxic. And what is happening is that this fight takes new guys in the form of religion, in the form of displays of patriotism, in the form of attacking a president because he comes from a different race. And a large part of white America hasn't been able to accept the fact that you can have Barack Hussein Obama as president. Now, yes, a lot of them have. The liberals have. A lot of them in the big cities have. And a lot of them look up to America. And that is the hope for America, that that tolerance and that inclusiveness wins. But now you have a very strong fight for the soul of America, which is paralyzing the country and making it unable to tackle challenges. And politically, America is not as powerful as it seems. And that is the point I'm making, that neither is its military as powerful, nor are its rules as powerful, because other people have problems with it and are questioning its rules, and neither are its institutions as powerful, because the other parts of the world have come up. The East is now back after 2 centuries of colonization and conquest and exploitation. The East is back on the rise again, bit by bit. The Chinese economy has grown, the Vietnamese are producing shoes, the Indians here are coding just a few kilometers away. The Europeans also provide competition to the Americans, particularly in highly skilled industry. The Germans, with their Mittelstand and their culture of high production standards, are there in the quality end. The French, of course, have a monopoly over luxury goods. Not really a monopoly, but you know what I mean. They prey on people's vanity. French goods are of course, the finest. The Italians are there in their traditional sectors. After all, this tie is Italian silk, right? Why? Because the land of Italia is seen as the sexy land, huh? You want to buy Italian stuff, huh? The Ferrari, the nice leather goods, huh? So it's an interesting world wherein it's a very competitive world and there is competition there. And so the rules which America, with its battery of lawyers and its primacy of the English language, drafts in a certain way that are against others, and if it has institutions like the World Bank and IMF which are not going to make space, which is thanks to the US Congress. It is not accepting repeated requests by the Obama administration to give a little bit more voting rights, a little bit more, of status to countries like China and India. Then the Chinese have said, we are tired of waiting. We have our own club. You don't let us join your club. We have the BRICS Bank. We have the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. In any case, now we are the ones lending money to African nations. We are the savers. We have multi-trillion-dollar reserves. You are the debtor. So why should you dominate? That is the political question. Politically, if you're an empire, you have to know when to give. That is what America knew very well. After the Second World War, America created its domination by getting the Europeans to head the International Monetary Fund, even though the Europeans had lost. America managed to get Japan to buy into its order. It managed to get Korea, South Korea. It managed to get many countries, sometimes through conducting coups. But still, most people preferred America to the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was just run by lunatics. Stalin had murdered 16 million kulaks. So, between a country that had segregation and a country that would just arbitrarily, randomly kill anyone and spy on everyone, people thought, okay, America is the better option. But somewhere down the line, America has lost that dynamism to make political adjustments. Maybe they've become arrogant with power. And so you have this fascinating American phenomenon, whereas that politically they are not as powerful as they seem, even militarily. They are tied up. The Americans are tied up in Afghanistan still. They are tied up in Iraq, which George Bush Jr. will go down as one of the worst presidents in American history because of this monumental blunder of going into a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. It's like the 9/11 attacks were done mainly by Saudis. It's like, okay, you attack me and I say, well, you give me a lot of oil, I'm like a cocaine addict, I need that cocaine of oil, so I can't beat you, but I don't like that guy. I'm going to beat the crap out of him. And they broke all the rules. That was an illegal war. Both Tony Blair and George Bush are nothing like better than war criminals. But because they were the dominant powers, they were not tried. But once you break your own rules, other people stop believing in it. Once you violate the sanctity of your own institutions, you've just taken a few bricks away from it. And not just a few bricks away, you've chipped away at its foundations. It was an act of monumental self-destruction by America, and its military is still tied there. And so they may fly their planes and send their aircraft carriers to scare China from building its islands. But really, they can't put pressure on China, and the Chinese know it. They can't put pressure on India as they did in 1971. They sent the 7th Fleet to scare India because they were siding with against a democratic India and they were opposing a democratic India, and they were siding with a highly autocratic Pakistan, where the military was practicing a policy of systematic rape of Bangladeshi women. So politically, that era where they were controlling things more easily is over because military, they are too tied up. They have overextended, just like many empires in the past. And that brings me on to the third prism, culture. Because of American actions, today, yes, America still dominates culturally. Yes, Hollywood and Harvard still dominate the imagination of the masses as well as of the classes. Harvard for the classes and Hollywood for the masses. Yes, anyone good at technology anywhere in the world wants to be a Steve Jobs, wants to be an Elon Musk. Yes, Silicon Valley is certainly a dynamic place. Yes, you still have no other alternative to America and American culture, whether it is the way people dress, whether the way people live, whether it is consumerism, or whether it is economic policy and discourse is very influenced by America. Even electioneering in most countries is going the Americano way. People are hiring American consultants. This country is no exception. And yes, all that is true, but a new zeitgeist, as the Germans say, is stirring. A lot of us who are looking for alternatives are not looking to America. None of us here want to have American culture. The hosts I have been living with, they're an old family. They are Telugu Tamil. They have a culture of cuisine, they have a culture of art, they have a culture that is indigenous and rich, they have a culture that is far more sustainable when it comes to society, when it comes to social cohesion, and far more sustainable when it comes to community, and certainly far more sustainable when it comes to the economy and the when it comes to the environment, because it is not based on wanton consumption. Most of us come from a frugal culture. Most of us reuse things in our land. The same is true for very many other parts of the land. And I think now, culturally, increasingly, America is associated with excess. Yes, it is the dominant culture, but the more dynamic part of world culture is looking for new ideas. It is not looking to America. It is looking even to the decaying European powers in having bicycles, for instance. America brought the idea of bicycles in its cities from France. Similarly, a lot of ideas in terms of music, in terms of literature, are coming from other parts of the world. Let's take Africa, for instance, long neglected, called the Dark Continent, whatever it meant. It was basically plain and simple racism. But Africa is now coming up with some of the most exciting young writers. Of course, there are famous names like Chinua Achebe, but there are younger writers like Chimamanda Adichie. And she has an incredible voice, and she talks about the danger of one story, the idea that you listen to many narratives. Al Jazeera is trying to capture discourse. Discourse in popular media has been dominated by the British and to a certain degree by CNN, BBC and CNN. But that is being challenged. Now take our example. Fair Observer, what is it? It's 1,500 plus writers from over 40 countries. It has a 16-year-old from Gaza. It has got Americans living in Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley. It has got Kenyans. It has got Finns. It has got n number of people challenging the dominant narrative. Because all of history in some ways is mythology and all of news is fiction. So those of us who come from the land of the Mahabharata understand complexity. And so we want a more complex story, and we want many characters in it. Not a simple linear CNN, these are the good people, these are the bad people. This is the axis of evil, and of course, these are the goody-goodies with whom we go and pray. So that look at context, that look at the deeper issues behind the news, and that plurality of perspectives is something we are doing. If you go back 30 years ago, my father's generation, would somebody from India work with some Arab boy and a Russian girl and a German mentor and create this? Not quite. So all across the space, you're seeing new changes. And culturally, I think there is now this seeking for a more sustainable, for a socially more cohesive, and certainly, even at an individual level, a more fulfilling way of life. And I think the American way of life and American culture fails to offer that. And America, in particular, of late has become a very deeply unequal society where those at the top are increasingly heartless. And by that I mean it's a society where the public schools have been gutted, where public infrastructure is crumbling. You go to East Asia today and you see airports and train stations and schools. You come to America and you see great campuses of companies. You see beautiful mansions. You see private schools. Apparently there's one called Nueva or something. You see great individual wealth and poverty that stares at you in the face when you step on the streets. And I don't think that kind of culture will retain its draw for too long, because the America that exercised its spell on the world was an America wherein people drove cars in the sunny boulevards of LA with the sun reflecting from tail fins. It offered a promise of peace and prosperity. Today, America offers neither peace nor prosperity. And the idea of America is an idea that is no longer that powerful. So, more than its relative economic decline, more than the political dysfunction, it is fundamentally the loss of appeal of America's culture that will eventually create a more fluid world. We don't know what will emerge, because the emerging economies in some ways don't have the cultural confidence and bravery to come out with their own paradigms. Yet, ironically, India, around 1930s and 1940s, was much more culturally creative. Rabindranath was alive, writing in great Bangla prose and poetry. Gandhi was alive. Madan Mohan Malaviya was creating Banaras Hindu University. There was a diversity and a dynamism and a sense of self-discovery. There was a civic conscience. In some ways, we've lost that. We are seeking for our soul again. And the same is true for the Chinese. The Chinese went too far. The Chinese have a saying now, I'd much rather cry in the back of your BMW than on the back of your bicycle. And this is a Confucian country, where scholarship has been venerated for 2 millennia. And the Chinese are now trying to find their soul. And the Europeans, of course, are an aging society. They are going through a refugee crisis and the rise of the far right, and they are in some ways schizophrenic. They see themselves as tolerant, but then they have to look down on the rest of the world. They haven't sorted out their post-colonial psychology. The Middle East, of course, is at war. The Africans have a long way to go. They've been exploited for far too long. The Latin Americans, well, as they say, Brazil is the country of tomorrow, but it seems that tomorrow never comes. So, all these places have massive problems. But it's my fundamental belief that out of these crises, new paradigms will emerge. Out of this process of churning, we will see a new world take shape. And what we know for certain is that the balance of power that we have known since 1945 will change. And with that, questions, please.
That was a wonderful talk, Atul.
Thank you.
You got a tour of the entire world and an insight which was wide and deep. Thank you so much. Friends, before we open up to all of you, just a couple of announcements. Coming Wednesday, that is 25th of November, we have a talk by a very interesting man by the name Nipun Mehta, and he talks on Gandhi 3.0. He promotes compassion, giving, and a very interesting scope of things that he does at Saptaparni. This is on Wednesday. Do come. On 2nd of December, we have Mr. A.S. Dulat, the gentleman from RAW who wrote an amazing book on Kashmir, who will be coming and talking at Manthan on Kashmir today. That again is at Saptaparni. So there are two events that you may want to make a note of and come over. Thank you very much, and Atul is yours. Go after him.
Yes, sir. Yes. Please.
Close.
Sir, now the state in India seems to be that dishonesty, crookedness, deception, deceit, corruption seems to be the norm rather than the exception. I don't know how, I don't really know how this has come about, possibly because the Indian mind has been raped for 1,000 years, first by the Muslims and then by the white man. Can you comment on this? What can be done? Things have gone completely out of control. If you step outside and look at the traffic, it doesn't look like human beings are driving. It looks like animals are driving. So things have gone completely out of control. What can we do to get back control?
There's a lot of assumptions there. I think we have to be careful about the Indian mind has been raped for 1,000 years. I think there's a distinction between Muslim rule in this country and British rule in this country, because the Muslims came and settled here. They didn't go back to Samarkand and Bukhara. So at the end of the day, yes, there was exploitation. Farsi was the language, official language of the country. Yes, to be at the top, you had to be not just Muslim, but Sunni Muslim, at least in the north. But it wasn't the exploitation of the British. The British basically stole everything and took it to their tiny rainy island. And the number of famines that happened in British India have never happened throughout millennia of Indian history. And also, we must remember that the South, deep South, wasn't really ever colonized by anyone other than the British. And by that I mean Kerala and even Tamil Nadu in some ways. So let's take a step back and look at independent India. And yes, we must remember that we are not having the same number of famines anymore. And so everything we say about India, ironically, the diametrically opposite is also true. For some reason, India still continues to be a land of contradiction, and therefore we have to develop a capacious mind to deal with it, and therefore Indians do very well dealing with ambiguity. So, do we have dishonesty in India? Absolutely. Do we have corruption in India? Absolutely. Do we have we seen a collapse of a certain civic virtue and a civic sense? Absolutely. Have we seen a loss in our cultural confidence and bravery? Certainly, most definitely, 200%. It's very interesting. I come back to India after 14 years, and when I'm in my native state, and I will say in Hindi, "Haan bhaiya, kya haal hai?" And the answer will be, "Good, good. How are you?" And my response is, "क्यों भैया कबूतर की तरह गुड़गुड़ा रहे हो?" अंग्रेजी तो मैं बोल लेता हूँ अंग्रेजों के साथ भाई, देश में हूँ तो हिंदी तो बोलने को मिले. So, you know, the very fact that we have a generation that doesn't speak its own language, is ashamed to speak its own language, and thinks it has to speak English to get ahead, is in some ways a brutal testimony to the fact that when it comes to the use of language, Macaulay won and Gandhi lost. The ghost of Macaulay dances over the ghost of Gandhi. And so, yes, I accept all of that. And I think the root of change in India has to be reinvigorating discourse, reinvigorating ideas, and start the kind of questioning that led to the independence movement. The independence movement did not happen in vacuum. It happened because there were n number of societies discussing ideas. Whether it was the Brahmo Samaj discussing what kind of reforms you needed, whether it was anti-caste movements, whether it was movements to remarry widows. There was a whole churning, social, cultural, and intellectual going on. That's what we are missing today. How many people here question the fact that we still live under Macaulay's Penal Code and the 1861 Police Act? We are still governed by the IAS. One day the chap sits in culture, the second day he's in agriculture, and the third day he's going to run finance. This is a joke. This is a bloody joke. Benjamin Javet's illegitimate children, basically the civil services, dominate the country. It's still a top-down structure. Do we know who is responsible for removing garbage in our colonies? Do we have a number we can call, an office we can turn up? No. It's a top-down colonial structure. So in a way, I always give this analogy. India got a shiny new car once we got independence. A shiny new car who looked a bit Italian. Nice Ferrari, but inside it has the ambassador engine. The structure is still one decided by people like 19th century colonialists, Benjamin Javet, Macaulay and company. Now, the big question I have is that do we talk about changes that we want in the way we run our societies, in the way we run our communities, and in the way we collectively, politically organize ourselves? We sort of create, there's a new state here, right? Telangana, great. I was listening to stories, I got an education. It was all very good, jolly good, but the state Telangana will still be run pretty much according to the colonial pattern. In some ways, Gandhi was brilliant because Gandhi said, let's get rid of the top-down order. Let's have village assemblies run themselves. Let's have a town mayor run. Why do we need a DC? A DC was a district collector who just came to collect taxes. What's he doing? Why don't we have a system just as the Germans have, or the Japanese have, or the French have, or the British have? They didn't create this IAS, IPS system in their country. If you go and work for the US Treasury, or the UK Treasury, or the German Treasury, or you work for the diplomacy, they test you very extensively whether you have aptitude for the job. In our country, we test you in one exam, which is a catch-all exam. And that exam is supposed to select people who will be officers. So they're supposed to ride horses and be macho. And it will select diplomats who are supposed to argue and have a forked tongue and speak beautifully and mellifluously, like Metternich or Talleyrand. And the same exam will select the chap who will be the tax collector and be perfect in accounts. This is a joke. This is a 19th century travesty of a joke. Select someone to be a tax collector with a head for numbers who's really good at accounting. Select someone for diplomacy who can move across cultures, who can speak well, socialize well, and most importantly, and very importantly, draft treaties and look at treaties as well. Select someone for your police, or select someone for your intelligence with abilities for gathering intelligence. Select someone for investigation with a really fine eye for detail and a really good head for law. I mean, this civil services exam is a joke. It's putting square pegs in round holes and expecting that if you clear one exam, you're God. This mindset is idiotic. So I think we've got to change the mindset, and that is a slow process. I foresee at least 2 to 3 decades of conversations across the country about social values, political structures, economic systems, and then we can move forward again. But before that, no, we are going nowhere. Yes?
Here.
Yeah,
Hi,
please.
I'm Murchana. So my question comes in parts. So firstly, how much longer you think capitalism and this disequilibrium in demand and supply are going to persist? And secondly, which country do you think is most likely to adopt socialism, even though it's a very utilitarian concept, and become the next big world power?
Well, there are lots of assumptions there. So, which country is going to adopt socialism? Well, you could argue France is a socialist country. 56% of the GDP is controlled by the state. So, France is largely socialist. There are lots of socialist countries even today. So, I don't think that socialism ipso facto, which is Latin for basically, let me not get complex, okay. Break it down very simply. So, socialism does not lead to world power. Socialism and capitalism and communism are very Judeo-Christian ideas born in 19th century, born in Europe. Capitalism in its modern form is supposed to be the idea of Adam Smith, a product of Presbyterian Scotland. Communism is a product of a German Jew who was fleeing as a political dissident, living in Europe, living in England, smoking cheap cigarettes and imagining utopia. Analysis of problems was perfect. His prescription that Soviets would gather and workers would unite and everyone would then sing Kumbaya turned out to be, shall we say, a little off the mark. So, I think new economic systems are something we have to configure, because a big challenge we are facing is there may be no need for workers anymore. You have robots. Earlier you started a car company, you employed a lot of workers. So the worker came out from the factory, he went and bought himself some tea, biscuits maybe, bought vegetables, bought clothes, bought gifts for the family during Christmas. So there was or Diwali, whatever he was celebrating, there was a multiplier effect. Now you open the same car factory and you have tons of robots, a few people. So there are very few jobs for workers in lots of industries. Then you have artificial intelligence wiping out jobs. This whole computerization thing gives you Facebook that you can play with, but it also means a large number of jobs go invisible. They vanish like that. And so we don't know what systems we have to emerge. Do we need to create a society wherein, do we need to create an economic system wherein somehow society rewards planting trees? Because tell you what, if you cut all the trees in the Amazon, GDP figures will go up and employment will be created. Why don't we do that? What's the problem? If people are poor, why don't they sell kidneys to others who can afford it? Why not? Right? The Chicago School of Fundamentalists in the otherwise lovely region in the Midwest. The Midwest generally has salt people, what was the term? Salt of the earth people. But the Chicago School has people who view the world as an abstraction. They are as cold and ruthless as Robespierre, who instituted the war on terror in France. Everything was an abstraction. He was trying to create utopia and the perfect land of virtue. Human beings are complex creatures. I mean, as Indians, we know that because our myth is the Mahabharata. Everyone's imperfect, including Krishna.
Okay.
So we've got to create new systems. So I don't know when capitalism in its current form will collapse. I think it will, because it's not environmentally sustainable. Social cohesion and inequality, other problems. But I don't know if socialism as we've known it is the solution. Yes.
Okay, I had just a different question in the sense,
Please.
You see, this Gandhian system of decentralized governance and decentralized production, decentralized economics, etc., etc. We have all talked about it.
Yeah.
And 73rd Amendment, 74th Amendment, all were supposed to do that.
Yeah,
But
sure.
do you think we'll ever be able to reach that?
Yes, the state is crumbling in India. Everyone knows that. By that I mean, if you talk to people in the government, what do they say? Do the IAS officers control the district the way they used to? Are our intelligence services half as good as they used to? is a diplomacy of 700 IFS officers enough to promote and project India's interests? Indian society is dynamic. Indian economy is dynamic because people save. You have the chap who's working in the shop, working from morning till night. So Indian society is largely functioning autonomously. And it's not because of the government largely. So
no,
I
but
don't
wouldn't this lead to a thing like rise of local lords, like Pappu Yadavs?
Well, that is happening as well. You're right. That's absolutely happening. And so the reason the Gandhian system never took place is because India was a very hierarchical society wherein local institutions had been destroyed. And it's not just India. If you read Nelson Mandela, he talks about the best example was there in his ancestral village. But that was destroyed by first the British and then the apartheid regime. So a lot of the autonomous institutions have to be recreated. And we've talked about it, but eventually it'll be collapse, it'll be, you know, the sheer failure of the state and crisis that'll force us to make things more decentralized. Because let's face it, let's take a simple example of centralization. The Congress party outvoted Mahatma Gandhi twice in the Congress Working Committee. Subhash Bose defeated Pattabhi Sitaramaiah, and Gandhi had said that Pattabhi Sitaramaiah's defeat is my defeat. Was Congress a democratic party then or not? Was yes or no? Yes, it was very democratic. It had diversity, it had debate, it had voting. Then you come to modern Congress party where state party units decide everything. You know, the person who heads the local party will be decided by the High Command, which is like Madam Sonia from Torino. Huh? She decides who heads, whoever runs in Andhra or in Ahmedabad. Huh? What is this? Is this a joke? Or take the other example. Narendra Modi decides who's going to be running here, there, and everyone instead of a primary. For all its faults, America has a primary system. There's an American here sitting in the back of the room. Go and ask her. Does her local mayor candidate, who's responsible for cleaning the rubbish, by the way, if the mayor doesn't clean the rubbish, you can go and bang on his door and say, hey, what are you doing? My rubbish hasn't been cleared. He goes through a primary system. He has to shake hands and kiss babies. Whilst here, you have to go and bribe the party secretary to get a ticket. It's top-down. So we adopted the top-down Westminster model. It'll crumble over time. The Mughal Empire crumbled. These new empires in India are in the process of crumbling. Bit by bit, Congress is getting less and less seats. New local feudal lords are arising. We have Mamta, whose thugs are more ruthless and beat, you know, the locals more with greater enthusiasm than the communists, because the communists have become fat and lazy. They've been in power too long. You have Lalu Yadav, of course, who loves his khaini and makes IAS officers roll them for him. You have Mulayam Singh Yadav, who has the reputation of a semi-criminal, who, when women get raped, says that, you know, boys sometimes get over-enthusiastic. So we've got a bunch of clowns, and I think over time, as Indians become more aware and Indians become more assertive and Indians become more aspirational, we'll say, look, clean the rubbish. I don't care about your rubbish. I care about the rubbish on the street. Just clean it.
If the oil trade was not done in US dollars, what would be the fate of American economy?
Pretty bad.
I read somewhere that it would be worse than the Greece economy.
Well, that's debatable, but you know, because they have a lot of things going for them. But if the oil trade, or if any of the international trades were not done in dollars, the American goose would be cooked. And in fact, whenever they play footsie, when it comes to the debt ceiling, that is the height of the political dysfunctioning in America. They are playing footsie with the future of America. If America defaults on its debt, and they always say they won't extend the debt ceiling, which basically de facto means America will default on its debt. then the dollar will no longer be the reserve currency. Already others are starting to trade through barter, through swaps in other currencies. So Americans need to be very careful with that. The day the dollar is not the de facto reserve currency of the world, the king has lost control over the mint. In the old days, the king controlled the mint. Why do we have this saying, Sikka chalta hai mera? Literally, you know, this is Urdu, right? My coin runs. Because when you became king, your coin ran. If someone else minted coin, you chopped their head off. Right? So the dollar runs in the world. But now Americans can't chop everyone's head off. It's too expensive. Besides, they've become fat and lazy too. They are like the communist thugs of Bengal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have a question, but with the permission of the people here, I'd like to take you on your bureaucracy bashing and Macaulay hatred. The very fact that we are the largest speakers of English in the whole world, we Indians, that's one thing which unites this country. Now,
arguably so.
Now, I am an ex-bureaucrat. I worked in the Indian Police Service as well as the Indian Administrative Service. So it'll be wrong on my part not to defend my old
Sure.
court.
I mean, you're part of a club, you have to defend
Yes,
it.
exactly. No, but I'll tell you how and why it's happening. There are 8,600 IAS officers who are trying to run or ruin this country, as you look at it, of how many billions of people? More than 1.3 billion people. Now, the thought which you said that it may take 2 or 3 generations or more about whether you should be in the culture department or the agriculture department, we have had situations where governments have sent us to the West, spending millions of rupees to study urban development, and you come back and you're posted in rural development department. Now, all this is changing. It's going to happen faster. The concept of aptitude, the concept of knowledge, and we Indians are actually running the world. You go from Australia to any country, the best of the medicine people, the best of the brains. Why do you think people are coming to be Bangalored? It's become an English word. The Americans have lost their jobs to us Indians. So at 65, going on 95, I'm proud of my own country. I'm a Muslim. I know there's a lot of Muslim bashing going on in my country, but yet I have high hopes with my body politic of our own country, and we shall survive. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll tell you we'll survive not because of the bureaucracy, but in spite it. So let me get into the assumptions. We Indians are running the world. That's an assertion. That's not an argument. Just because a few Indians do very well internationally doesn't mean that we are in top positions. We are doing very well technically in medicine. We are doing exceedingly well in the entire technological realm. Actually, no, let me rephrase it. We are doing very well in the IT sector. A lot of German engineers complain that Indian engineers don't like to get their hands dirty. And I'm teaching. I'm now a visiting professor at IIT. And I teach at Berkeley as well. So I get to see both systems every day. Not every day, that's an exaggeration, but I get to see it regularly enough. And the fascinating thing about the Indian system is that the students are hungry, they want to achieve. The systems are rotten to the core. Let me take you on your old service. There are monkeys who sit in the HRD ministry, absolute monkeys who don't know the E of education, and they will decide who will be the director of IIT. You and I know that there are a lot of young bureaucrats, both in the IS and IPS, and from day one they want bribes, and there is no accountability. This is the complaint of all older officers, off the record. People in intelligence bureaus say that the young officers today are writing nothing better than bad press reports in bad English, with shoddy grammar, terrible punctuation, and no logic. There are people who sit in the finance ministry who, if you ask them what quantitative easing is, will start saying, chai loge? Samosa khao? which means let me get you tea and let me get you a snack. The level of incompetence in this Indian bureaucracy makes my blood boil. You earn, why? I'll put it very simply. Everywhere I go in the north, I see the term adhikari. Adhikar. What is adhikar? Adhikar basically is right. Adhikar. In a poor country, God damn it, you should be kartavyakari. You're a servant of the state. So let us go through the assumptions. Is the English language generally a good thing? Well, I studied Shakespeare. I love the English language. I wouldn't be running a journal in England with an editing team in London if I didn't love the language. But did I forget my own language, or did I not learn French, or did I decide to just stick to one language? There's a distinction to be made between attributing the unity of India to a language and a distinction to being proficient in that language. You're conflating two separate ideas. Correlation doesn't mean causality. If it rains every time in Hyderabad, if there is a cat on the roof, you don't say, look, there is a cat on the roof, therefore it is raining. Okay, so lots of jumbling of ideas. Sure, there are good officers. Sure, there are people of high competence. But structurally, this model is flawed. Let's take, very simply, the idea that one day you can be in border security force, the other day you will be handling investigation, and the third day you'll be in intelligence. Well, why don't we have something like the FBI and something like the CIA, separate recruitment from day one? Because we don't need to create first amongst equals, primus inter pares. That's what we do. We create a caste system within our civil services. The top guy is the IAS guy, and he'll be health secretary, and he will lord it over the doctor, who of course knows nothing. I mean, let's take taxation. Why is there no lateral entry? Someone like Vikram, let's say he's done with working for corporates and he wants to give back to society. Few people will understand taxation and company matters as well as him, because he's a clever fellow. He spent his life learning about it. Why couldn't he go in the finance ministry? He cannot. All right, I used to be in the IPS once upon a time. I used to be fairly fit. Most people know that. I'm still fairly fit. Do you think I will be asked about anything, despite having traveled the world and done fairly well in different parts of the world, on any policy issue? No. Because there will be some bloody babu who's probably a retard who will decide the future and destiny of a country of over 1 billion people. I have withering contempt for the bureaucracy of this land. Absolute withering contempt. Yes?
Yeah, I have a simpler, milder question. My question is on the changing balance of power. I'm assuming that you and I will meet here 40 years from now, and you'll be here and I'll be here too. And I want you to build a scenario as to, will any of our borders in the South Asian region change?
That's actually a harder question than that one. That one is an easy, obvious one.
No, will any of the IAS officers sign those treaties is a different question. We'll talk about it later.
No. I mean, the borders, it's a big question, because actually, the answer is I don't know. But my feeling is, and this is a feeling, this is not something that I can say, oh, this is a rigorous intellectual analysis. No. What is happening, and I've written about it a lot, is that the Sykes-Picot order in the Middle East has crumbled. The borders that were completely arbitrary are gone. I mean, Kurdistan is a de facto reality in Iraq. Islamic State operates across Syria and Iraq. Regardless of whether it's defeated, the populations now are used to a borderless civil war there. The ruling families will topple, including the Saudis, who, for me, are the international equivalent of cocaine dealers. They sell oil, get a lot of money, and they support an extremist version of Islam, which damages Muslims most of all. Pakistan was founded by a Shia guy, and I was on Skype with someone 2 years ago, and the person was getting very nervous. And I said, well, what's the problem? And she said, well, you know, my brother has gone to medical college. Ooh, I said, what happened? Is he ill? No, no, he's a doctor. So there's been a shooting. Guess what? Sunni fundamentalists just shot dead Shia doctors. I mean, we know what's happening in not just Pakistan, but a lot of these societies that were very tolerant, very, very, very tolerant, that had cultures of Sufism, that had cultures of various heterodox systems of Islam. And you get an influx of Saudi money. Bangladesh. I have Bangladeshi friends, some of them diplomats, who off the record are planning to immigrate, quit and immigrate to Europe and the US. I'm sure you do too. Those of us who are in the government have friends across the border who are deeply worried of the radicalization, and they all blame the Saudis. They say the Saudis are destroying our society and country. So going back a step back is that this is not sustainable, because people don't want to live in an age of terror. Robespierre fell in France. Stalin's system crumbled, and Islamic State will crumble. And similarly, what is happening in Pakistan is not sustainable, because Pakistan is a very diverse society. It has got, of course, the Pathans, it has got the Punjabis, it's got the Sindhis, it has got Mohajirs. So, but at the moment, the radicalization is weakening this society, and the radicalization in Bangladesh, sorry, the state, the radicalization is weakening Bangladesh. So will we have borders as we have today? I think these borders are very artificial. When Radcliffe drew the line, he hadn't been in India. Second, when he came to India, he was suffering dysentery. So the joke is he was sitting on the pot. That's why the line is so jagged. He was sitting on the pot and literally exploding. That's why the line is jagged. It went through people's homes. And so for hundreds of years, even at the height of the most fundamentalist Turkish rulers, the economy of India was never disrupted. If you were a peasant, you grew your grain, you could always take it and sell it to the town. If you were someone making handicrafts or textiles, you could always take it and sell it. India was always a natural, the whole of South Asia was a natural, unified economic area. What the EU has created after so many centuries in Europe. But you sort of, maybe because it's the Indian, we are happy-go-lucky. We've never had such a strong state. A strong state is a very European creation. It's a creation of the Treaty of Westphalia that happened after 30 Years' War. It happened out of the centralization that occurred in Spain once Ferdinand and Isabella married, and in France. And it came at a heavy price. You killed all the Jews, expelled them in Spain. You kicked out all the Protestants from France. It happened after St. Bartholomew Day's massacre. It happened after Louis XIV's dragonnets. In fact, the French Protestants, the Huguenots, left for England. I used to live in the Huguenot quarter in London. It's fascinating. And then they, of course, went to Paris, not Paris, my apologies, to Berlin, which is where you have the Franziskaner Kirche, the French church. And they brought industry to Prussia, which opened its doors. They took watchmaking to Switzerland. That's why Tissot, the Swiss watch, is actually a French family that fled thanks to Louis XIV. So France shot itself in both its feet by its intolerance. But the French nation state was created through uniformity of church, through uniformity of power. All the regions were crushed. And I think that model was exported to the rest of the world. And the borders, I think, my feeling is, the borders in 40, 50 years in Africa and South Asia will follow the Middle East model. The world that the Europeans have created will vanish. It was a world created through nothing but blood and iron. It was guns, God, and gold, as I say it. And I think even if political structures sort of remain the same, even if we retain our brown sahibs, the IAS and IPS, right? The system of the generalist judged through one exam and that's it. even if we retain that, I think eventually there'll be trade across the borders, because it doesn't make sense not to do something that was done for thousands of years. That border is totally arbitrary and totally divisive. At least economically, we should be able to sell stuff and engage with each other. And at the end of the day, we are fundamentally, culturally similar enough across the whole subcontinent. I mean, even the north, I come to your home, yes, you cook the dishes in a slightly different way. You make rasam and sambar and we make dal. But generally, we don't eat the way the Europeans do, with courses and all that. There are 10 different dishes, there's yogurt at the end of it. There is enough of a similarity all across South Asia, whether you begin from Kandahar, whether you go to Dhaka, whether you go from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. That is certainly true. And so I think eventually maybe politically structures will change, because what is political structure? It is just how you decide to run society and how you share power. The Mughals had a different structure to the Turks. Before that, the Rajputs had a different structure. The Tambrans had a different structure. But these things change with time. Politically, maybe we'll become more decentralized. Regional parties are already coming up everywhere. We have a new state here. All that is true. But economically, it doesn't make sense not to get zafran or saffron from Kashmir. Can you imagine a biryani in Hyderabad without saffron? And that's my point.